Monsters have been the face of our irrational fears and captured our imaginations since the beginning of civilization. Like our fears, they come in all shapes and sizes and meet us in our nightmares. They can be physical manifestations of evil, serve as metaphors that reflect our current anxieties, or they can be cautionary tales about the consequences of man's meddling with the natural order. Movies have been the perfect medium to explore the darker corners of our minds and help create the iconic representations that we will forever associate with these movie monsters.
Welcome to an all-new Movie Monsters, brought to you by Be Terrible Productions and Horror Movie Freaks. For more movie monsters and tons of other exclusive horror-related content, visit horror-movie-freaks.com. On this episode, we're going to explore slasher films. That means we're going to talk about the formula and some of the movies that define the genre, as well as, of course, the legendary killers that, over the years, have sliced and diced their way through hundreds of horny teens. But first, let's touch on the history. People have a fascination with death. No shit, right? Life is short, and we're afraid of our own mortality. Yet there's something exhilarating about facing our fears and confronting death. It's a big reason why people love to watch horror. There's a long history of audiences turning up to watch macabre entertainment. Le Théâtre du Grand Guignol was a Parisian theater that operated from 1897 to 1962. Men and women showed up by the hundreds to watch stage actors tell grim stories with elaborately gruesome endings using impressive special effects. The public was going to the theater to watch characters get murdered. Slasher movies would carry on this tradition. The 1980s are the golden age of the genre, and in fact, between 1980 and 1989, 290 slasher films were released. In almost every way, the 80s were a decade of excess. From the economy to entertainment, consumerism had become the American dream, and more had officially become more. At the same time, technology was evolving at light speed, with the space race at the forefront of the US identity. Homes now had computers, cordless phones, and with a Walkman, you could take your music with you anywhere. Pinball machines were being wheeled out of arcades and replaced by Pac-Man, and in an age of excess, the movies reflected it with buckets of blood and copious amounts of nudity, and a sort of every man for themselves mentality. Like Gordon Gekko and other powerful moguls, these killers trampled over bystanders to get what they wanted, which in both cases seemed to be getting up in the guts of some blonde chick with big tits. In fact, you may say that Freddy and Jason were sort of the Donald Trumps of their time, only nowhere near as dangerous. So, what are some of the tropes that define this genre? You probably already know the basics. Psycho killer in mask stalks teens and murders them in inventive ways. But what are some of the others? In most cases, adults are absent from the picture. If you're smoking pot or having sex, you're done for. And also if you're black, you're probably not gonna live long either. Sorry, not my rules. The final girl is gonna be the one that eventually stops the bad guy. She's usually the most conservative girl of the group and brunette for some reason. She typically is also gonna have a gender-neutral name and is either a bookworm or a tomboy, but she's always a virgin. So now, let's go back a little further than the 80s and get into the evolution of the genre. 1960s Peeping Tom features a voyeuristic photographer who takes pictures of his female victims to capture their expressions as they die. It features the trope of the killer murdering beautiful women and the use of the POV shot. That same year features another movie that's even more important to the genre. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho is one of cinema's most enduring and influential movies, and the shower scene is probably one of the most iconic in movie history. Giallo is a genre created by Italian filmmakers in the 1960s. The films feature elements of eroticism and graphic violence, and they're derived from many of the same influences as their American counterparts. Mario Bava became the leading director of giallo, helming several of the important films, like A Bay of Blood. It's about a group of characters that all devise plans to murder the others for possession of a small bay. Another Italian filmmaker would merge giallo with the American slasher, a director named Dario Argento. Deep Red is a murder mystery with Hitchcockian overtones, but it implements several elements that have been developing over the years, such as the POV shots of gloved hands killing victims, shots of weapons in motion, nude women, and a focus on the kills and the gore, as well as a reveal in the twist ending that both apes Hitchcock and serves as an inspiration for Friday the 13th. Now, before we get to the big three slasher franchises, there's two other movies that we have to touch on. The first is Last House on the Left. In 1972, producer Sean Cunningham introduced the world to legendary horror filmmaker Wes Craven with a film that Craven shot, edited, and directed. It's based on Ingrid Bergman's The Virgin Spring, and it tells the story of a group of sadists that lure two unsuspecting teens into a disturbing fight for survival and bloody retribution. In many ways, Craven's responsible for the rise of the exploitation film, specifically the rape revenge genre, which is a great addition to any resume. Okay, now on to the second, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The name alone elicits an almost physical response. This is an unflinching and unsentimental movie about a group of teens that break down next to a literal house of horror, and then they get slaughtered one by one by a chainsaw-wielding maniac and his cannibalistic, inbred redneck family. Leatherface is a former butcher that wears human hides over his face that kills people with the movie's title chainsaw. Despite Leather's hulking size, director Tobe Hooper described him as a big baby, reluctantly doing what his family tells him to. Interestingly to note, A Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Psycho were both inspired by the same true-life, grave-robbing corpse fucker, Ed Gein. Texas Chainsaw introduced audiences to the mask-wearing maniac, the teenagers, or 20-somethings playing teenagers, I should say, the in-camera violence, and even the final girl. Despite the fact that Texas Chainsaw Massacre is almost the perfect textbook example of the slasher film, it's 1978's Halloween that ushered in an era of imitators.
Now, we come to the first of the big three slasher franchises. John Carpenter set the world of horror on fire with this game changer. It's the gold standard, and it's one of the most influential movies ever. Michael Myers breaks out of an institution 15 years after murdering his older sister. He returns home to the small town of Haddonfield, and the bodies start piling up. No one but Dr. Loomis, the doctor that cared for him in the institution, knows exactly what he's capable of, and it seems it's up to him to stop this maniac. Meanwhile, teen Lori is babysitting on Halloween and realizes that she's being stalked by a knife-wielding murderer. The iconic mask is made from a repurposed Captain Kirk mask, and it's ironically become one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces, the face of a deranged and methodical monster. He carries a giant kitchen knife that he stabs the fuck out of his victims with, but of course, he gets creative with his weapons too, especially in the sequels, because, audiences get bored with the same old impaling time and time again. In the original Halloween, it seems like he's just some disturbed dude, but the doctor knows he's something much worse.
I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
It would be 3 more years before Myers would return in a movie that literally picks up right where the last one left off. This is a legit sequel. I mean, it's not as good as the first one, but it still had Carpenter directing, which really does add a lot to it. Season of the Witch is a major departure, and fans rejected it outright. They wanted more Michael, and that's what they got. Every few years, another entry was released, but the sequels could never recapture what made the original so great. As it went along, the kills got more graphic, but the story got more convoluted, and Michael lost the very thing that made him so terrifying and work so well in the first place. Part 2 reveals that Lori is actually Michael's sister. Then in part 4, she dies in a car accident, so Michael just starts pursuing her daughter Jamie, played by a young Danielle Harris. Then we find out he's being worshipped by some pagan cult or some shit. I don't know. I tried to repress it. After that, on the 20th anniversary of Halloween, the story from 4 and 5 is retconned and Laurie is back from the dead, only to get killed again. The series would run until 2002, when Myers is finally defeated for good at the hands of who else but Busta Rhymes. And then, Rob Zombie rebooted it in 2007 with the sleaziest Halloween yet. For real, I felt like I needed a shower after I watched this.
Oh, the whore with the big tits hanging down to her knees?
Maybe I'll choke the chicken, purge my snorkel all over them flappy-ass tits.
Good, we'll have a good fucking time.
I will.
I hope she likes cripples.
Bitch, I will crawl over there and I will skull fuck the shit out of you.
Oh, I'll get the crutches for you.
It's full of miserable, unlikable people, and it spends half the movie trying to justify Michael's killing spree, and then it basically becomes a beat-for-beat remake of the original, with way more blood and way more tits. He followed it up with a sequel that wasn't as bad, but really, that's like saying getting kicked in the dick sucks less than getting kicked in the balls. I mean, they both hurt like shit, but one just happens to hurt a little less. When you do start to track the genre's evolution, it's easy to see how reliant one of these movies is on the other, and how these filmmakers borrowed so liberally from their contemporaries. Few examples, though, are as obvious and apparent as the next of the big three. Producer Sean Cunningham, who had previously worked with Craven on Last House on the Left, decided that he wanted his own Halloween franchise money. So he started brainstorming, looking for other sinister holidays to exploit, when it came to him, Friday the 13th. Now he had a concept and a title, but nothing else, except for an ad that he purchased in International Variety magazine that had the tagline, "The most terrifying movie ever made." Bold statement, especially considering there wasn't even a script yet. But alas, the movie did get made, and it kicked off a long-running series that's a favorite to many slasher fans. I wouldn't say it was the most terrifying movie ever made, but hey, I prefer crunchy peanut butter to creamy, so what do I really know, right? In the original Friday the 13th, a boy named Jason drowns while horny camp counselors are busy getting busy and neglecting to watch over him. Years later, when a new group of camp counselors show up to reopen Camp Crystal Lake, the bodies start piling up. Friday the 13th is a giallo film, even more so than Halloween was. It's a revenge movie that is also a murder mystery, and the reveal takes another page straight from Argento's playbook. What it's not, though, is a Jason movie. In the end, we find out that Jason's mother was actually the one doing all the murdering. In Friday the 13th Part 2, Jason does arrive, this time donning a burlap sack over his head, and he starts hacking people up with a machete because some other counselors killed his mommy. This is one of the better in the series, but it's still not a Jason movie. It's not until the third Friday the 13th, which is actually the 3D Friday the 13th, when Jason finally dons the hockey mask and becomes the villain that we all know and love. An icon that rivaled Michael Myers, and like Michael, Jason just won't stay dead. On a side note, Jason's the most well-traveled of the slasher villains. He's been to Manhattan, hell, and even the outer reaches of space before heading over to Elm Street for a bloody showdown between him and the third killer of the big three, which we'll get back to in just a minute. But alas, he came back home because home is where the heart is, and he returned to Crystal Lake in 2009 for the reboot. I like it okay. The portrayal of Jason is actually really cool and maybe my favorite of the series, but ultimately it's just a rehash of things that we've seen before. The Friday the 13th series was never very popular with critics, but the audiences loved it. The entire series was built on the foundation of creative kills, and it does trump Halloween in that department. Thanks especially goes to makeup artist Tom Savini. While Jason and Michael and dozens of others were spilling blood in the multiplexes all over the country, Wes Craven was busy creating his own monster. He was inspired by Carpenter, as well as his ex-partner Sean Cunningham, and he wanted to carve out his own mark on the genre. After reading articles about otherwise healthy men that were terrified of falling asleep and then died when they inevitably did, he came up with a simple and dark premise: a murderer that stalks and kills his victims in their dreams.
In 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street, a girl named Nancy has a friend that's confronted in a dream by a knife-gloved man in a boiler room that attacks her. When the bodies start piling up, and Nancy's confronted by this ugly Christmas sweater and fedora-wearing bad guy in need of a skin graft, she uncovers a dark secret about the adults in the town's past.
They discovered heinous crimes that a man named Freddy Krueger was committing against children, and they took matters into their own hands and killed him in the boiler room. And now, he's back. Only now he's a much bigger problem than he was before. See, while Michael and Jason are slowly lumbering towards their victims, waiting for them to eventually trip or run up the fucking stairs or something, Freddy Krueger just waits for you to inevitably fall asleep. Comfortably in your own bed, might I add, before he comes for you. Nancy realizes that it might be up to her to stop Freddy, and she rigs up her house with a bunch of elaborate booby traps, Home Alone style, which is something that actually occurs in several of Wes Craven's movies. In most other movies in this genre, the teenagers are fucking idiots. But the ones in A Nightmare on Elm Street are at least portrayed as being a little more resourceful and a little more intelligent. In fact, it seems like the parents are the real fuck-ups in this series. See, while the kids are out battling with literal demons, the parents are dealing with their own metaphorical demons, which really does add an extra layer to it. These movies partly take place in a dream world where the line between fantasy and reality are blurred, and that makes it a little bit more heady of a series. Plus, it means that the filmmakers could get incredibly creative with the kills. After the original, Craven walked away, never really intending it to be more than a one and done, despite what the studio had set up in the end of the film, because they weren't ready to stop milking what they saw as a potential cash cow. Krueger actually is the perfect lead for any of these slasher franchises because he's supernatural from the start, plus he's a real cut-up, meaning he's got more personality than the other slasher killers. And as a matter of fact, it always seems like he's kind of working on his tight 5-minute stand-up bit, but he just can't get past using these really bad puns. Says the guy using puns like cut up. Because he feeds on your deepest fears and isn't confined by the laws of reality, he's able to turn into all sorts of fucked up shit, which just adds to variety. With Freddy, Michael, and Jason now on the Mount Rushmore of monsters, people were now turning out, not to see the heroes win, but to see the killers do what they do best. Appearing in magazines, games, cartoons, talk shows, and even on their own TV shows, these killers became icons for the MTV era. The 80s were the golden age of the slasher movie, and teens everywhere were lining up for the latest entry into their favorite series. But as the 80s came to an end, so did this era. In 1991, Freddy died, and Freddy's dead, closing the final chapter in the saga. Or did it? No, it didn't. After spending 10 years away from his most iconic creation and watching it slip into the realm of self-parody, Wes Craven decided it was time to come back to the series and fix Freddy's legacy with a proper send-off this time. A New Nightmare took the series in a dramatically different direction, one that further blurred this line between reality and fantasy.
In order for the movie to continue, it was dependent on me having more nightmares. Well, fortunately, I did.
And it replaced the cartoonish character with a Freddy that was, again, truly terrifying. In this movie's universe, Heather Langenkamp is a star after her role as Nancy, which honestly may require the biggest suspension of disbelief in the film. She lives in LA with her husband and her young son, and one night she dreams of Freddy, and shortly after that, she's offered to reprise a role in a New Nightmare film. Well, no shocker here, but people start dropping like flies on the set, and her husband is soon killed. Something bad is happening, and this time, it's in the really real world. She decides to go visit Wes Craven to figure out what's going on, and he explains to her that Freddy is an ancient demon that feeds on people's deepest fears, and he's carrying on the work of his fictional counterpart. This movie is badass. It takes Freddy's mythology and it turns it on its head by deconstructing the entire genre, as well as its impact on culture, which spawns a new era of meta, self-referential humor. And that, my friend, brings us to the next evolution brought to us courtesy of Wes Craven with Scream. Craven adapted Kevin Williamson's screenplay that was originally titled, get this, Scary Movie. Sid Prescott is a depressed and prudish high schooler dealing with the murder of her mother when Ghostface, a Halloween costume-wearing killer with an obsession with horror, shows up and starts stabbing people to death. Scream, a lot like A New Nightmare, exists in a world where characters know and watch movies. It's able to find the perfect balance of horror and comedy while still having a grounded and dramatically interesting story. The characters are well written and fairly likable, and no doubt you're going to recognize the majority of them, even if they haven't showed up in a movie since 1996. Scream's a murder mystery, full of red herrings, great kills, and it plays with well-known tropes, and it's able to feel familiar while still managing to subvert expectations. It's really the whole package. One character, Randy Meeks, is a die-hard genre fan, and he reminds characters in the story and the viewers at home about the rules of horror films, which, if followed, is actually basically a survival guide for the movie. But who's gonna sit around and listen to some freak obsessed with movies? I just made myself sad. Ghostface is a nod to his predecessors, but it's also a wholly original character. He is a masked killer, but he's obsessed with slasher films, he talks, and he's vulnerable like a person. More accurately, people, motivated by human emotions, and the reveal at the end is truly one of the more surprising moments in horror. This may not be the most popular opinion to true horror fans, but I think Scream is my favorite entry into the slasher genre. There have been sequels. Scream 2 in particular plays with the idea of sequels and tropes in a way that elevates it above most sequels by winking at its audience. Sort of like 22 Jump Street. All of the follow-ups have their charms, with 3 probably being the weakest of the series. After Scream, there was a small resurgence, but most of those were a complete shit. Like I Know What You Did Last Summer. Jesus, even the title of that movie is terrible. These knockoffs were the very thing that Scream had just now finished satirizing. And now we're in a postmodern era. Films like Hatchet, Cabin in the Woods, Behind the Mask, and even Final Girls are all fun movies played with a very heavy sense of irony. They're self-aware and sometimes jokey, but never mean-spirited about where they came from. These movies are the evolution of horror. Anyways, for the most part, this genre has been set aside for now. First, in favor of home invasion and torture porn, and then we went into the found footage era, and now it seems like we're back to mostly supernatural and, of course, possession movies. All these franchises that we've discussed have been rebooted, but none of the reboots were able to grab the public like they did the first time around. Because times are different. The world is different. But for those of us that stayed up late on Saturday nights for Jason Lives or roamed through the horror section of the video store looking for a Nightmare on Elm Street Dream Warriors because you always thought the box looked cool, slashers will live forever, like the killers in the movies, always reminding us of a time and a place when we were young and facing our fears meant staring into the black eye holes behind a mask and not covering our faces when the blade pierced the skin. The time of the slasher movie is over for now, but it may come back around. And until then, there are literally hundreds of movies ready to be dusted off, or little undiscovered gems that are just waiting for you to try and seek them out. So stay up late on a Saturday night, pop some popcorn, grab a spot on the couch, and enjoy the carnage. Thank you for stopping by. If you enjoyed this video, do me a favor, take just a second to click that little thumbs up button down there. It really helps me know, and it helps spread the word of movie monsters. Head over to horrormoviefreaks.com for more exclusive content and subscribe. That way you can know every time a new video is released. I'm Jeremy. Be terrible.